I have an opinion about the Santa Claus 2. So, we see Scott Calvin again, and he's starting to revert back into Scott Calvin and not Santa Claus. And we know this because Scott realizes he's starting to lose a lot of weight. And then Scott asks Bernard and Curtis that what's happening, and then they tell Scott that there's a clause he didn't fulfill. And then Scott reads that on the card he got from the Santa coat. And then turns out Scott needs a wife. And Scott was unaware of this. And so they make a toy Santa to take Scott's place while Scott goes to find a wife. And then Scott goes back to his hometown. And he goes on a couple dates, and then Scott meets Carol, and they really hit it off. And back at the North Pole, we see that the Santa that Scott, or the toy Santa that Scott and the elves made to replace him so the other elves wouldn't get concerned, turned evil, took over the North Pole, made evil nutcrackers. Back at Scott's hometown, Scott is really hitting it off with Carol, and then Scott tells Carol everything, and then she doesn't believe him at first, because no one ever believes Scott when he says he's Santa Claus. And then Scott brings her back to the North Pole. Carol and Scott help defeat the evil Santa Claus. Scott and Carol get married, and then Scott turns back into Santa Claus, and then Scott goes on his Christmas run. And then Scott and Carol live happily ever after. Also, we're going to need a Scott counter again. I wonder if this one is going to be more Scotts than yesterday's Scott counter. So yeah, Scott counter 2.0. Let's go. And overall rating, 12.